Okay, so now we have sent the reminders, but the next thing that we need to do is that we also want to dynamically update the status of our item with all the comments and responses that approvers are providing while we are waiting for other approvers to complete. So the objective is basically we don't want to wait here for all of the approvers to complete their approval actions and only then be able to find out what their responses were and what they said, whether they rejected it or whether they requested for a change or whether all of them approved it. We want to be able to get the response as soon as one of them provides a response. So if first approver approves it, we want to see their response and their comments as soon as possible. If the second approver rejects their task, then we want an immediate action rather than waiting for the rest of the approvers to provide their response and only then be able to reject the item and then terminate the workflow. But we want to take immediate action as soon as the second approver who responded and rejected the item, we want to take immediate action as soon as they do so. We want to reject that item. We want to terminate this workflow as soon as possible with all the comments. So that's our objective. That's what we want to do. We want to make this approval workflow as dynamic as possible, just like our old friend SharePoint Designer workflows. Okay, so for this purpose, let's create a copy of this send the reminders action here, because the next branch that we are going to create will be similar to this branch here. And once again, we will create a parallel branch along with this send the reminders action. So just underneath the create an approval action, let's add another parallel branch and then click on my clipboard and just select the send the reminders action, which is just a copy of this action here. Let's open this one up. Let's rename it and just call it do until. And once again, we will use the same condition here that repeat until the reminder is equal to false. Now, even though we will not be sending any reminders within this loop here because the reminders are being taken care of here, but we will still use same variable to control the execution of this loop also. We will make sure that our limits for this action are also correct. Now, what we are trying to do is we are trying to update the status of our approvals as quicker as possible. In this branch here, we were sending the reminders to our approvers every day or every 3 days, for example. But this one here, we want to run, for example, every hour. So we want to make sure that the current status of our approval is updated every hour at most. So if an approver responds to their approval task, we want to make sure that their approval status or response or comments are updated within an hour. So for that one, we will put the delay for only 1 hour. Let's increase the delay for our reminders to, let's say, 3 minutes or 2 minutes. In reality, this will be 2 days, for example, but for our testing purpose, because we will be testing, I'm just putting it 2 minutes here. Okay, but for this one, I will reduce the delay to only 1 minute. But in reality, 1 minute is too frequent. So maybe we will make it 1 hour when we deploy it in our production environment. But for now, we will keep it 1 minute. So if this loop keeps repeating every hour, then the number of times that this loop will run in a month will be much higher than 60. So we will change this 60 to 720, which is roughly the number of hours in 1 month. So that means now this loop will keep running 720 times in a month every hour. And the timeout value, we can leave it as 30 days. All right, let's close this one. So then after this delay of 1 hour or 1 minute, we will move on and we will check the condition again for this reminder variable, just like we did in the reminder section. So we said that, okay, if the reminder is still equal to true, then we want to go on and continue processing our approvers' responses. But if this reminder is not true, means it has become false while it was waiting here, then it won't do anything and will just go into the no branch, which is empty, and the do until loop will terminate. All right. So again, when the reminder is still true, what are we doing? We are running this loop for every email address, same as in the reminders. For every email address, which is the approver's email address, we will check whether they have provided a response or not. And for that, again, we will use that same Dataverse list rows action with the same condition as before, and we will see whether the response is available for that email address in our approval responses table. If it is available, then we check the condition whether the length of that response is equal to 0. If the length of the response coming from this list rows action is 0, that means that approver has not responded. And if that approver has not responded, then we don't have anything to process. But if the response is there, only then we want to process something here, right? We don't need this send an email action here. Let's get rid of this reminder email now because we don't want to send reminders now. But this time, what we will do is we will change this is equal to is not equal to 0. This will only be true when there is a response found, when the length of the response from this action is greater than 0. And if the response is there, then we need to process it. Now, this is very important to understand that whatever the response that we are getting from that responses table for that email address, we need to check that response and see what their response is. Have they approved their task, or they have rejected it, or they have requested for a change from the original requester? So for that purpose, we will use a switch control here. All right. And for the switch control, we will provide the response that we are getting from this list rows action. And the response is coming in a property called response. So as you can see from the list rows to action, which is that action, we have a property called response. This property contains whatever response that email address or the approver with that email address has provided. And we are using that response action over here in this switch command to check it, that what is it? Is it approve or reject or request for a change? And notice that how when I have selected this response within this switch, it has put it within this apply to each loop. This is again because the list rows might be returning more than one rows, even though in our case it will be returning only one row at a time for that email address because of our filter condition, but it will still be written as an array. So that's why it's enclosing it inside this apply to each. That's fine. We are not worried about that. Okay. But now we have these case options available for this switch structure. So the first case that we will have would be if the response is equals to approve. If our case is approve. So let's quickly rename it. If the case is approved. And then similarly, we will need another case here for reject. So let's quickly rename this case also with case reject. And then thirdly, we may also have a response where the user might have said request a change. Now remember that I'm writing full response, request a change here, not just request, because the operator here is not contains, it's equals. So we need to provide the full value of the response. And then I'll just quickly rename this also. So we have three cases here based on what responses we are getting. It could be either approve or reject or request a change. And we need to take different actions in case of each response we are getting. Okay, so let's look at the reject case first because this would be the simplest to implement. So if an approver has responded as reject for their approval task, then what do we want to do? We want to perform similar actions as we did in our reject conditions when we matched those conditions here. If you remember, we were checking our conditions and we said that, okay, what are the conditions? Is the condition reject? If the condition is reject, then we were grabbing all the comments, we were sending a rejected email to our requester, and then we were updating our item with proper statuses and comments. Okay, so we need to do similar things. So what I will do is I will quickly copy this reject email action from here onto our clipboard so that we can reuse them here in our reject case here. But before we do that, before we send the email to the requester that their item has been rejected, let's get a fresh copy of our item from SharePoint. Okay, so I will use the get item action, and our SharePoint list as usual is the classic site, and our SharePoint list name is the travel requests, and the ID will come from our original trigger when an item was modified, ID. So this action will make sure that we retrieve the current item with all of our comments and statuses and everything in it. And then we will use the outcome of this one to update our item and send the proper email to the requester. All right. So let's now send the email to the requester, and the requester email address we can get from the get item to action also. It doesn't matter, or from the original trigger. Same thing. Let's get it from get item to requester email. And then in the subject line, we can say your travel request rejected. And inside the body, we can say dear and the name of the requester display name. And then we could say that your following travel request was rejected. And then we can provide the details of the request. So we could use the actions from either our trigger or from our get item to action, it doesn't matter. And then below that, we could show them approval history. All right, and we could say that your travel request rejected, and we can actually add these icons also, as we normally do in our emails, just to give them a visual indication. And then inside the brackets, we can show the current date and time. So I will just quickly copy that. So this convert from UTC action displays the current date and time in Australian time zone, as we have done in our other actions. And then below this, we can display the email address of the person who has responded as reject. And as you know, that email address is coming from our array here. So this whole thing is running inside this apply to each 5 loop. And if we use the current item expression, if you remember, for apply to each 5, remember that you use the proper loop. The apply to each 5 is the one where the array elements are coming from. So we will use the current item from apply to each 5 and not from apply to each 6. So let's use that one. That's the email address of the person who is rejecting it. And then after that, we can also display their comments, and the comments are coming from our response, which is coming from our list rows 2. So we can use the list rows 2 comments property here. This is the one that will display the comments of that user within quotation marks. And then below that, we can display all of our previous comments for that item, which we can get from the get item to action. So we could say approval comments from the get item to action. This will contain all of our previous comments if there were any, right? So we are showing this whole approval history in the email to our requester. All right. After that, we need to update our item with proper statuses. So we will go and use the update item action for SharePoint. And once again, we will use the classic SharePoint site as usual, and our SharePoint list, which is the travel requests. The ID we can provide from this get item action also, get item to ID, or you could use the trigger ID as well. It doesn't matter. It's the same item. And then in this one here, for the status value, we want to change the status to rejected. Remember, this is the reject case where the approver is rejecting the item. And what we want is that as soon as the item is rejected by any approver, it should just update the statuses to rejected and terminate this whole thing, right? For the approval comments, we can actually copy and paste same comments from here and put them in here. So they will be updated in our SharePoint list also. Remember, the *WF column or field is used to determine whether we want to restart our whole workflow or not. Now, in this particular case, because the workflow is being rejected, the approval is being rejected by the approver, we don't want to start it. So we will put a value of no here, and we will leave everything else as it is. Now, after the item has been updated and email has been sent to the requester that their item was rejected, do we still need to continue this whole loop? Do we need to continue waiting for all of our other approvers who are still waiting to respond? We don't want to wait for any other approvers anymore if we have received the reject response from one of the approvers. Okay, so in that case, we want to terminate the whole workflow here. So ideally, I would like to put a terminate action here, that as soon as the item is rejected, I have sent the emails to the requesters, I have updated my item, I would want to terminate my whole workflow here because I don't want to continue. But notice that when I select a terminate action here, it gives me a message saying that the operation terminate cannot be used inside a for each. And notice that we are inside this for each. And this whole for each is a loop which is basically inside another for each loop. And that whole for each loop is actually sitting inside this do until loop. So we don't have just one loop, we have multiple loops, and the terminate action cannot be used inside any loops. So how do we handle this situation? We need to terminate our workflow here. For this, we will use the help of a variable. Okay, we will use a set variable action here, but before we set the value of that variable here, we will need to create that variable in our workflow. So we will go up here where we created the var reminder variable. We will now create another variable here, initialize variable, and we will call that variable var terminate, let's say. Okay, and this is also a Boolean variable, and initially the value of this variable would be false. We only want to terminate when the var terminate variable becomes true. Okay, so that's the variable. Let's quickly rename it, and then below here in our do until loop where we were looking at our reject case, we will set this variable, which is the var terminate, to true, because this is where we want to terminate our whole workflow. All right, so now this action will make this variable true, and then after that, this whole section that contains this switch structure will repeat inside this apply to each 5 loop for the next approver. But if the response is reject, we don't want to even check the responses of the remaining approvers. We just want to terminate. Okay, so that means we would need to add one more condition here, that not only check if the response that we get is not equal to 0, means there is a response, but also check if the var terminate is not true. Okay, so we want to add another row, and we will say check that var terminate is not equal to true. All right, so basically this condition is saying that only run through all of the email addresses while the response of each of the responder or the approver is greater than 0, means they have responded, and the terminate is not true. If the terminate is true, no need to do anything, just terminate. So obviously, if we are in the reject case and we have set this variable to true, initially it was false, but now we have set it to true. So when this loop repeats, for the next approver, we may have a response from the Dataverse, but because var terminate is now equal to true, so this condition is false, which says not equal to true. Hence, it will not go into the yes branch of this, and will go into the no branch and will come out of this loop. So it will keep running for every email address, and every time this condition will not meet, and ultimately it will come out of this apply to each 5 loop. And when it then goes into the do until condition here, then in the do until condition it checks whether the var reminder is false. No, it's not false, it's still true. So it will try to go inside this delay and then keep repeating everything again. But that's not what we want. We want to make sure that if the response was a reject, then we need to terminate everything. So we need to come out of this do until loop somehow, okay? And the only way that we can come out of this do until loop is that we define a condition here that matches. Right now there is only one condition with this reminder variable. So we need to add another condition along with that. Now there is no add a condition kind of feature available here for the do until loop. So we will need to go into the edit in advanced mode and add another condition over here for our var terminate variable. So you can see that we have this condition already here. Let's copy that whole condition and put it inside our notepad. And this is one condition, but now we want another condition like that, where we will say that where our var terminate variable is equals true, means keep running until the var terminate variable becomes true. Okay, so what we will do is just get rid of that @ sign, bring this condition here, put a comma, and now we have two conditions. One condition is this one, and the other condition is this one after this comma, and we need to put both of these conditions inside AND. So we will enclose the conditions within this AND structure. And now we can copy this whole thing, go over here, remove our condition and paste this condition. So this is our new condition now, which makes sure that this whole section runs until the var reminder becomes false or the var terminate becomes true. So when the terminate variable becomes true, even though var reminder variable is false, so the loop terminates as the condition has matched. And when the loop terminates, it comes out of this loop here. This whole loop structure terminates, and outside this loop, we will add an action and we will add a condition. And in that condition, we will check the var terminate variable again, and we will check whether the var terminate variable is true now. Okay, if it is true, then we will say terminate the whole thing. We don't want to continue, and we will use the succeeded in the status. So as soon as one approver has responded reject, this whole do until loop will terminate because of the var terminate variable. And then when it comes out of that, it will go and terminate the whole workflow. And also remember that because we are terminating the whole workflow, any remaining approval tasks for any remaining approvers would again become orphaned, and they will show up in the approval center. So to get rid of those orphaned tasks, we can once again add that dataverse action or update a row and choose the approvals table, provide it the approval ID, which is coming from our create an approval action, and just go and update the status to inactive. As soon as we do that, then our orphan tasks will be removed from the approval center. But remember that we need to put this update a row action before terminates. So I will move this one over here. So that takes care of all of the orphaned items as well. This is not important. This action is not necessary for our approval workflow to work correctly, but it's always a good idea to keep our approval center clean. All right, so this one is our switch case for the reject scenario. All right, now we need to look after our remaining two scenarios in our switch structure. One for the approve case and the other one for the request a change case. We have already taken care of our reject case here. Now, the request a change case would be easier because it will be very similar to our reject case. So I will quickly add these actions over here also, and then we can discuss them. Okay, so I have now added similar actions into the request a change case, just like reject case. So if you look at our reject case, you will see that we have similar actions in our request a change case also. So first we got the item, a fresh copy of our item, and then we are sending an email to our requester saying that the travel request needs more information. We are saying that dear requester, an approver has requested more information for your request, and then we showed them the request data. The approval history, we are saying travel request rejected. So this should be travel request needs more info. At this time, this comment is being logged. And then for visual hint, we could show them a time clock here just to mention that this is being paused here because they need more information. The current item expression grabs the current user's email address who has responded and their comments, which is coming from our list item action here, the list rows 2. And then below that, we want to display any previous comments, which will come from our get item 3 action. So we can say comments will come from our get item 3 action, approval comments. And then for our update item action, we have chosen our SharePoint site and list, which is the travel requests. The ID we can use from our get item 3 action here, get item 3 ID. That's the item we want to update. The status value. Now we want to change the status value to pending, not rejected or approved, but pending, because one of the approvers have requested for some more information. Hence the status would be pending. For approval comments, we can copy these comments from here again and update them on our SharePoint list. Start WF. Do we want to restart our workflow when a request for more information or request a change is being provided? Yes, we need to restart our workflow. So for that, we cannot put no here. We have to put yes. In case of rejection, we did not want our workflow to restart. But in case of request a change, we do want to restart our workflow. Therefore, we are providing this yes value here. But even in case of request a change, we don't want to wait for any other approvers who may still be waiting to provide their response. We want to terminate this workflow and restart it. And when it will restart, it will recreate the approval tasks for any remaining approvers. So we will see how that works. But for now, we will choose our not remainder, but terminate variable and provided the value of true that we want to terminate this. So as soon as this variable becomes true and this whole thing comes out of these loops, our do until loop condition here will match and this whole loop will terminate. Okay, so that takes care of our two cases, reject and request a change. And let's save our workflow quickly. Okay, so that's saved successfully. And now if we look at our approve case, this is going to be simple but very important one. So in this case, what we are saying is that if a user has responded as approved, then we want to do two things. First, we want to get a fresh copy of our item, just like we did for our reject and change request a change cases. So let's get the item. All right, once the item is there, then we want to update our item. Okay, so let's get the update item action. So for the update item action for our SharePoint site and list travel requests, we will choose the ID from this get item 4, which is here. So let's get that. Now, some important things here. What do we want to change the status value to? Do we want to change it to approved? No, we don't want to change it to approved. The reason being that this particular approver could be our first or second or third approver, and there may be some approvers still pending. So we have to keep the status as pending. Now for the comments, we can put the comments as that the comments were provided by which user. The user is coming from the loop, which is the current item, and the current item of apply to each 5, as we know, because that contains the email address. And then their comments, they come from the dataverse action, which is the list rows 2 comments. So we can choose that. And then we can also show any historical comments, which we can fetch from the get item 4 action. So that's there. So that's the comments that we want to update in our SharePoint list item. Now for start WF, do we want to restart our workflow? when this item is being updated? Maybe not. The reason is that the workflow is still in progress. The workflow has not terminated. Remember how we are still waiting for all of our approvers to be responding to our wait for an approval action here. So our approval workflow is still in pending. We don't want to restart our workflow again until all of them have responded or one of them have either rejected or requested for a change, in which case we have taken care of it, right? But in this particular case, because the workflow is still in progress, we don't want to restart it until all of them have responded. So we will say no. Now the approvers done column here, which we created in our original SharePoint list. This is the first time that we are using this column because until now we didn't need it. This is the column that will contain the email addresses of all those approvers who have already approved. So initially the approvers done column would be either empty or will contain some information, right? Whatever information it has, we want to append the email address of the current approver who has approved, who has provided the response approved. We want to save their email address into this approvers done column. So let's do that. So first we will put the same approver done column, which is coming from our get item for action. So we will take that and then we will concatenate with it our current item, which is the email address of the person who is responding. Don't forget a semicolon at the end. So basically what we are doing is that as soon as an approver has responded to approve, we are adding their email address into the approvers done column of their SharePoint item. Why are we doing that? We are doing this because the next time when this workflow restarts, because of whatever reason, maybe the workflow has timed out, maybe one of the approvers have requested for more information or asked the requester to make some change in the item, whatever the reason is, when this workflow restarts, we want to make sure that when it restarts and creates the whole approval workflow again, it does not send the approval tasks to everyone, to all the approvers. It should only send the approval tasks to those approvers who have not responded yet or who have requested for a change. All right. This is the reason we are using this variable here, the approvers done column, and that approvers done column will be updated using this approve action here. And after this action, we don't need to do anything else. We don't need to terminate this workflow like we were terminating in the reject and request a change case. We just need to make sure that it keeps running. So for example, if there are 3 approvers, the first approver responded as approve. It will get the latest item and will go and update the approvers done with that email address. Next time, the second approver also came in and responded as approve. This time again, it will fetch the latest item along with the approver's done value. Whatever the approver was previously added, along with that, another approver would be added or their email address would be appended to that. And so on and so forth. So as soon as the approvers are approving, their email addresses will be appended here. But one thing we need to make sure that this update item only runs when the approver's email address has not been previously added. If it's the same approver whose response has already been checked and their email address been updated, then we don't need to re-add them into this field here. So for that, we will need to use a condition here. And in that condition, we will simply check based on this get item for action. We will check if the approvers done, which is coming from the get item for action, contains the email address of the current approver, which is coming from the apply to each 5 item. So we should say does not contain, right? If the approvers done column does not contain the email address of the current approver, only then go and update the item with its status and append the email address to the existing approvers done. Okay, so that takes care of everything here. But then we also need to make sure that when this whole approval workflow restarts, it doesn't create the approval tasks for all of those approvers who have already responded. So we need to do some data manipulation here again to remove those approvers' email addresses from our approver emails and approver emails array variables. So the create an approval action creates the tasks only for the remaining approvers. So before we do that, let's save our workflow one more time just to make sure. Okay, so when our workflow restarts, it comes here and gets all the approvers from our SharePoint list, and then it parses those email addresses into our variables here, especially in this array. And then from this array, we select all the email addresses, and then we put those email addresses in our var approver emails variable, as well as in our approver emails array variable. So select action is the important action here. This is the action that has the array of all of our email addresses, the approvers email addresses that we fetched from our SharePoint list. Now we need to filter this array and check for each email address whether they have already responded or not. If they have responded, we need to remove their email addresses from these variables. So for this, we need a loop here that we will apply to each element of this select array. Apply to each, and inside the apply to each, we will use the outcome of this select, which is an array of all the email addresses that we have from our SharePoint list, which includes all of our approvers. And then within this loop, we will check a condition for each of the email address which is coming from this select array. And we will check it with our approvers done column, which is coming from our trigger. And we will check whether this one contains or does not contain the email address, which is coming from here. And you know that the current item expression, which is coming from the apply to each 7, will have the email address of one of the approvers from this array. So for each email address, we are checking whether the approvers done column does not contain or contains this email address. If it does not contain that email address, which means that particular approver has not responded yet. If they had responded, their email address would have already been added in the approvers done column in our approve switch, remember? But if the email address is not in here, that means they have not responded. So if they have not responded yet, we want to create a new approval task for them. So we need to include their email address in our variables. So for this now, we will use append to string variable action here, and we will use the variable approver emails. If you remember, we have this variable created here, and initially this variable was empty. And then here what we are saying is that in this empty variable, just add current item and a semicolon. Now current item is the email address which is coming from this output array. Similarly, we want to add another append variable action, but for the array variable, not for a string variable. And we will choose this approver email array, and we will add the same current email address without any semicolons, because this is going to be an array, into this variable. So for every email address which is coming from this output of the select array, it will go and check whether that email address is there in the approvers done column. If it is there, that means they have already responded. We don't need to do anything. If it is not there, if it does not contain that email address, that means they have not responded yet, and hence we need to add them into these variables so that we can create the approval task accordingly. So that should look after this one, and then after that we do not need these variables anymore because the variables are getting populated here in this loop here. So we can get rid of this set variable action as well as this set array variable action here. Or maybe we can reuse this action here. The reason being that remember that when we created these two variables here, even though the approver emails variable, which was the string variable, was empty, the array variable was not empty. We actually used this array variable to create the select array. And if we are now using that same array variable here to append the email addresses it will actually already contain a lot of email addresses there. So before we run this loop, we need to make this array variable empty again. So for that one, let's close this apply to each. Let's move this action over here and remove that output from here and just make this one an empty array by just putting these two square brackets there. So this way the variable will become blank again and then will be repopulated using this apply to each loop here with any of the remaining approver email addresses. All right, so that's I think all about it. So let's save our flow and let's quickly review it. So first time when an item is created and a user starts the approval workflow on our travel request, the workflow will come and get all the approvers from our approvers SharePoint list. It will create these two variables. It will populate all the email addresses into this array variable and create this select array. And then in our apply to each loop, it will check every email address whether they have already responded or not. Obviously, for the first time, none of the email addresses will be there in the approvers done column here. So no email address will be present in this approvers done column. Hence the condition will become true for every email address, and every email address will be appended to these two variables, the var approver emails variable and the array variable. And then after that, it will work as usual, create all the required variables, create an approval task for all the approvers using that same var approver emails variable. Now, assuming that this runs for 2 days or 30 days, and right now if you look at the settings of our wait for approval action, it's actually set to 2 minutes. Let me change it to 5 minutes. In a real life situation, you will not put any timeout condition here. This should be empty so that it runs for 30 days, or you can choose to put P30D. But for now, for our testing, we will just put it 5 minutes. So if within that 5 minutes or 30 days, 2 approvers respond and 3 approvers haven't responded yet, it will time out. And in case of timeout, it will go over here in the timeout branch and it will update our item. And when it updates, it will change the status to pending, and it will also make the start WF to yes, which will re-trigger this workflow and restart this whole workflow. And when it restarts, then remember that it will fetch all of the approvers again from the SharePoint list. But now because 2 of the approvers have already responded, so they will match here. Their condition will become false because the email address would be there. Hence, those email addresses will not be added to these variables. Only the email addresses of the approvers who have not responded will match this condition and they will be added to these variables. And then the approval will be created for only those 2 or 3 remaining approvers. All right. So I think we have done a lot of work with this approval workflow. I think it's time to test our workflow. So let's quickly go and create a new item. So here's the new item that I have filled in, and I will now go and click on save. The new item has been created here. Once I am ready, I can choose my item and click on start approval. So the start approval is our primary approval workflow. We'll click on run flow, and you should see that the status of our item will change to pending, and we should see some approval comments here. There you go, the status changed to pending and we got the approval comments here that the approval has started. Now remember that we have 5 minutes timeout setting. So our workflow, if no approvers respond, our workflow will time out in 5 minutes. But then we should also receive reminders every 2 minutes. And the approval status update happens every 1 minute. So keep those timings in mind. So let me quickly go back to our workflow here and see if the workflow has triggered successfully. And yes, it has. We can see that the workflow is running. There you go, as you can see. So it has created the tasks. You can see that the wait for approval is now waiting, and we also have our reminders and do until loops in progress. And if we now quickly switch to our approvers browsers, we can see that the approver has received this approval task for our Melbourne trip here, as you can see, which we just entered. I will wait for 2 minutes to see if we can receive the reminders. In the meantime, I can go into our other user, which is Chris Green. Chris Green has also received the approval task, as you can see, and I will not respond to them for now. I will just wait for the reminder to come. And after 2 minutes, we have received a reminder here, as you can see, that the following request is still pending. It's showing all the information. It even provides the links to respond to the requests. And now it will wait for 2 more minutes. So this time I will go into my approval task, and for Chris Green, I will go and approve it. I will say looks good. Just click on submit. Now for our other approver, they also received a reminder, but now I will wait for them again and see what is happening. So the reminders are going every 2 minutes. The status is being updated every 1 minute, and the timeout is happening in 5 minutes. So our workflow hasn't timed out yet. We have to see the timeout scenario also. But now only one user should be receiving the reminders, which is Jack Black, because Jack Black hasn't responded yet. So we will wait here to receive another reminder. And there is the second reminder that has just come through. So you can see now Jack Black has received 2 reminders. But if you go to our Chris Green, which is the other approver, you can see that they only received 1 reminder, and this time they didn't get the second reminder because they have already responded to the to their approval. As you can see, they have already approved it. Okay, so that looks good. Now let's wait for 1 more minute so that our approval workflow times out at 5 minutes, and then we will see that when it restarts next time, then does it actually create the approval task only for 1 approver, which is Jack Black. And there you go. After 5 minutes, when our approval restarted, you can see that it has sent another approval task now. The previous approval task would have become invalidated now. So that shouldn't even appear in the approval center. But if we look at our other user, which is Chris Green hasn't received any new approval tasks, because remember, they had already previously approved their tasks. So when the approval restarts, it actually filters the email addresses correctly and removes their email addresses so that their tasks are not created next time. So that looks pretty good. If I now go back to Jack Black's task and let me request for a change, and I will say update request. And notice that while we were doing this, we have received another reminder because the reminder goes in every 2 minutes. So I will say update the request and submit it. So now Jack Black has requested for a change. So our workflow should restart again. And if we look at our travel requests that we are creating here, we should see all of our workflow history properly being updated. As you can see, the approval is started. And then first time the travel request approval timed out at 30 days. Obviously in our case, it timed out only in 5 minutes. And then Jack Black requested for some update, and hence it has gone into wait again, saying it needs more information. Therefore, if we now look at Jack Black email address, Jack Black is getting another approval task now, and we can include all the previous approval history in this approval task also, which we haven't done in our case. But you can see that Jack Black received a reminder. He also received a renewed approval task. Now they can go in and say all good and submit. The other approver, which was Chris Green, didn't receive anything, not even an approval task because they have already approved it, not even a reminder because they have already completed their task. So that all looks pretty good, and because both of the approvers have approved now, our workflow should complete and it should not restart and our item should show complete history here with all the comments and then final status of the request being approved. All right, so that all looks good. Our workflow has correctly run as expected. So hopefully that has given you some new ideas to create your approval workflows. I understand that it has taken a long time for us to create this workflow and understand and do the whole testing, but hopefully it will help some of you. Please feel free to provide any feedback or comments down below. I will be happy to reply if you have any questions. With that, thank you for watching this approval workflow series, and I will see you again in some other video.